Today on the podcast, political engagement begins in the local church. Hey everyone, welcome to the Elmwood Midweek Bible Podcast, where our goal is to help you understand your Bibles and see how everything in it connects with Jesus. We're back today with another episode in our series on the principles of political engagement. And today we're talking specifically about how political engagement begins in the local church. Now, lots of people think that the church is this clearly partisan place where they can be told how to vote or what to believe on a specific policy issue. But that's not what we mean today when we talk about political engagement beginning in the church. So the question is, what do we mean? And before we answer that question and go into it a little bit more in depth, there's some groundwork that we want to lay. The principles that we've been talking about from week to week now about political engagement, they're not just standalone or isolated, but we desire them to be fully integrated and closely related to one another so that you can form a biblical approach to thinking about politics. Now, here's the first principle we talked about in our first episode on this, is that all politics are deeply religious because all people are deeply religious. There's nobody that enters the public square from a purely objective or neutral place. Every act of legislation that is codified is built upon someone's morality and worldview. It's built upon what God or gods they are worshiping. The second principle that we covered was that being a Jesus follower is by nature political. To be a follower of Jesus means that our allegiance is fully given to King Jesus above every other earthly leader. And what this does is it relativizes our relationship to every earthly political leader. It is a political thing to say, whether you like the politician or not, that your allegiance is not ultimately to them, but it's to Jesus. So then thirdly, we come to today's principle, and it's that political engagement begins in the church. So John, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there could be a more relevant principle for us right now to think about in our current political moment than this one, that political engagement begins in the church. Now, just to kind of unpack a little bit about what we mean by that, I want to just sort of say that in a couple different ways. And so the first way is this, that when we think about political engagement beginning in the church, what we mean is that we must live the kind of change that we want to see in our society. So if we want to see a certain change take place out there, we have to first begin by actually practicing that and modeling it ourselves. And so another way of saying that is that our first line of political engagement is the local church. We should engage out there in the public sphere, in the public square, but the first line of political engagement is within the local church. Now, let's just spend a little bit of time thinking about this a little bit more deeply. On Sundays here at Elmwood, we've been going through a teaching series on the Sermon on the Mount, and as many of you listeners are familiar with, the Sermon on the Mount begins with the Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes, what they do is they lay out for us this beautiful vision of the life of flourishing. And it's challenging, and we find flourishing in sort of unexpected places. But it lays out this life of flourishing, and then by doing that, it shows us the countercultural value system of God's kingdom. And so one of the things that as we think about the Beatitudes and as we think about this life of living out God's kingdom values, which has direct implications for our political engagement, one of the things we have to realize is that the Beatitudes are meant to be more than something that just shapes us as individuals. So of course we're supposed to be people whose lives are individually shaped by those Beatitude values, but the Beatitudes, like the Old Testament law, was not just meant for individuals, it was meant to shape the collective life of God's people. And so as we think about the Beatitudes and we think about living as people who recognize their complete and utter dependence upon God always for everything, that's not just us as individuals, but it's us as a church community together. In the same way, we hunger and we thirst for righteousness, for God to make our world right again, and for our lives to exhibit and to demonstrate the same kind of justice and righteousness that our Heavenly Father demonstrates. And we long for that not only for us as individuals, but we long for our church community to be a community that is characterized by hungering and thirsting after justice and righteousness. And lastly, as we saw this past week, we are called to live as heralds, as witnesses to this new covenant that Jesus is making through himself. And as we do so, we will experience persecution. And so as we go out and do that, we are called not just as individuals to go out into our individual personal conversations and have gospel conversations, but we're called to, as a church community, be a herald, be a witness to this life and ministry of Jesus. And so what we do then, as a church community, we go out into the public sphere, and we do so shaped by this beatitude set of values, this new set of values that characterizes God's kingdom. And as we do so, we go out into the public square shaped by the Beatitudes to advocate for policy and for legislation that promotes things like life and human flourishing and goodness and justice and truth and fairness and beauty. Now, of course, the challenge is that there are differing opinions and perspectives on the best policy to express our desire for fairness or truth or justice or goodness. So that's kind of a whole nother conversation in and of itself. But we're called to go out into the public square and to advocate for these certain kind of policies and legislations that exhibit this value system of God's kingdom. And when we do this, here's what we got to realize, that this must be an extension of what we already practice within the community of the church. So just to kind of put this in a different way, our first line of political engagement is in the local church. And it is so easy for us to fall into the trap of believing that the first line of our political engagement, or the way that the church, the primary way the church goes about engaging in politics, is through how we vote, right? That's really, really important, and it's a stewardship and it's a gift, but it's so reductionistic to take just how we vote and to reduce everything about how Christians engage politics down into that one thing of just how we vote. It's a gift and a responsibility of ours as followers of Jesus to engage politically, and that political engagement begins in the local church. And so just to sort of put some flesh on this, here's what this means. The church should be a model for the society around us, right? So we go out into the world and we seek to be people who promote justice and life and human flourishing and generosity and goodness. And as we do so, we have to really wrestle with the hard question: in what specific ways are we living as a just community, right? So in what ways are the people who call Elmwood home, the individuals who make up this church community, in what ways are we living justly and promoting justice and righteousness in our own personal sphere of influence? In what ways are we as a church family mobilizing communities of people to practice justice within our community? In what ways do we demonstrate that we care about doing what is right and what is just? And it's when we practice that we gain some sort of voice into the political sphere. So the church should be this model for things like justice, for life and human flourishing. So again, we have to ask the question: in what specific ways do we advocate for life? Now, I know that this gets reduced into basically the one issue of abortion. Abortion is an atrocity. It's a sickening evil that I just pray that 50 years from now we look back as a culture and say, what were we thinking? So it's awful, it's evil, but it's not the only issue related to life. So we care about life and human flourishing, not just in the womb, but also at every stage. So in what ways do we as a church family love and care and serve and protect and serve to really give advantage to people who are disadvantaged, like the fatherless and the orphans and the widows and the marginalized and the oppressed and those who experience injustice. So in what ways are we as a church family and as individuals who make up this church actually living as people who demonstrate and model a value of life? And then lastly, just the example of in what ways do we demonstrate what generosity and goodness looks like? Are we as individuals, are we as a church family, are we unreasonably generous with our time and our money and our possessions and our influences and every other resource that we have? Or do people look at us and think that we're pretty stingy, right? So in what ways are we demonstrating generosity and goodness? Do we love what is good? And do we seek to do what is good even when it will cost us? And so this is what we mean when we say that the church should be a model for the society around us, that as our local government and as in some ways our federal government seeks to enact legislation that is fair and just and promotes life and flourishing, we should be able to say, look at Elmwood Church as an example of a society within society that is practicing this kind of justice, that's practicing fairness, it's practicing a love for life and human flourishing. And I just think this is so critically important, especially right now, that we must never bypass the local church and in doing so, reduce politics down to something as simple as just how we vote. It is so much more important, so much more complex than that. And I really believe that the life of our local church should cast a compelling vision to the world around us for what a society of justice and flourishing and generosity and goodness looks like. So that's what we mean when we say that that political engagement begins in the local church.
That's good. It sounds like kind of to sum up similarly to what you said. It sounds like you're calling Christians to be consistent with what they say they believe.
Interesting.
Right? It's where it's at.
You would be correct.
Yeah, and it sounds like when we're, us going through the Sermon on the Mount, when we're doing that, then we can be that model. Then we can cast a compelling vision, and we do have the credibility to do it, which is something that's going to come up here in a minute. So as we think about applying this, I've got 3 kind of principles for us to take away and 2 questions. So the first principle is to remember that political engagement begins in the church, not in the ballot box. John had mentioned this just a moment ago. Certainly one of the ways that we express our faith in Jesus is by how we vote. And we talked about this in the last episode, that it is a gift and it is a stewardship that we are able to vote in our country. But that is not the only way. It is only one way to engage politics. And I would argue it's probably not the most important way. I would say that arguably the most important way that we engage politics is by living the kind of change that we want to see in our society. So that means whatever is going on in the public political sphere, Christians should be consistent across the board. The second principle is this. If we're not practicing this in the local church, like if we can't point to our community as the model that you were talking about, John, that as this just and fair and loving and good society, then we should not expect to have credibility in the public square. And I would argue we probably don't have the right then to have that credibility if we are not being consistent. The third principle is, apart from actually living this out in the local church, our engagement in politics looks like a desperate power play. So if we are not being congruent and we are not doing this in the local church, and then we're coming to the ballot box and freaking out when our rights or our positions or our influence is not the same, it looks like we are desperate for power. And I would say, I would go so far, which this might ruffle some feathers, it looks like we're afraid that if we don't get our way politically with the right political leader, that Jesus has ceased to be in control. And Jesus does not need you nor I nor John to defend him. He is king and he is sovereign, whether anybody likes it or not, or whoever the political leader of our country is or not. So we need to make sure that we're being congruent, because if we're not, then all we look is desperate, and that ain't a good look for Christians. And
we don't need any help looking desperate.
That's right. And it looks like all we care about is protecting our position and our influence in society. Right. And the reality is, John, you and I were just talking about this, even if Christians got their way when it comes to political policy, all we would create is people that look like Christians but are destined to spend eternity apart from God. We wouldn't be creating genuine Christians by just telling them to act like Christians. So we have to be very careful that we are not looking desperate and not trying simply to just change people's actions.
So to summarize that, we can't change a person's heart by enacting a certain policy.
That's right. That's a great way to summarize it. It makes me think of the passage coming up this Sunday where we think about the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees. There is something qualitatively different about being a Jesus follower. It's not just about quantitatively doing more good things, right? So I think that you summed it up well. It's a heart issue. It's not simply just putting into policy that we want people to hold our values. So here's some questions to think through as you go through this. In what ways does our community function, meaning our church community, function as a model of the things that we want to see as policy? So if you're thinking about a policy that you think embodies generosity or goodness or valuing life, first ask yourself, is our church community already doing that? Are we being consistent? And that should be encouraging, probably for some of us in ways that we're doing that, and maybe a little convicting for the ways that we're falling short, being consistent across the board. And the second question, in what ways are we demonstrating a better way? We believe that following Jesus is like building a house on the rock instead of on the sand. It is a better way to live, that putting your faith in Jesus, that eternal life, that life of flourishing starts right now, even if it doesn't always look the way that we expect it to look, like we said last time. But we believe that Jesus offers a better way, sometimes a way that doesn't cleanly fit into either political mainstream party. I would say Republicans or Democrats, right? Sometimes it ruffles the feather of both sides. And so in what ways are we demonstrating a better way? We have to take responsibility first as a local church and seek to embody what it means to be ambassadors of our King. So, John, you got anything to add to that?
Dude, that's good.
All right. Let's wrap it up. Well, we're now up to 61 subscribers.
Yeah.
So we have passed the barrier, and I suppose we should hopefully look towards 100 here. So maybe that's a better goal. So if you haven't already shared, or subscribed, we would invite you.
Or if you haven't already created a bunch of dummy YouTube accounts so you can subscribe and get us to 100, right. That'd be awesome.
Most of y'all listening probably have at least 2 or 3 emails. That's at least 2 or 3 subscriptions.
It's the least you can do for us, guys. Come on.
So anyways,
speaking of sounding desperate.
That's right. Oh man.
We love you. Don't do it. Please don't do it.
Please don't do that. Please don't unsubscribe. Anyways, thanks for joining us. We appreciate you tracking along. We hope that these principles are helpful, and we're looking forward to actually getting into this, political season even more, and some of these political principles, so that we can represent King Jesus well. So this is John and Matt signing off. We'll see you next time.